Morning, everyone, or beg your pardon, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you may be joining us from this today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this launch event for the United Nations Multi-sectoral Response Plan to COVID-19 for Barbados and the OECS. I would like to start today's event by establishing protocol and welcoming our distinguished guests, the Right Honorable Gaston Browne, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, and Chair of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, the Right Honorable Alan Chastanet, Prime Minister of St. Lucia, the Right Honorable Santia Bradshaw, Acting Prime Minister of Barbados, Ms. Utoikamanu, then the United Nations Under-Secretary General and High Representative for the Least Developed Countries, Landlocked Developing Countries, and the Small Island Developing States, distinguished representative of OECS governments, representatives of regional organizations, excellencies and member of diplomatic corps, diplomatic and development partners, heads of the United Nations agencies, funds and programs, members of the media. Again, welcome and thank you for joining us for this launch event and appeal. My name is Michelle Brathwaite. I'm the National Human Rights Advisor in the Resident Coordinator's Office for Barbados and the OECS. I would like to thank everyone for joining us virtually for this event, and I'm happy to inform you that this event is also streaming live on YouTube. Please note, for participants to this event, that your microphones will be muted but for the speakers, but that the participants, such as yourselves, are free to send comments or questions to the section at the bottom of your screen. I have been told to explicitly make clear not the chat section, but the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. And we will take your questions at the end of our presentations. We are all here today because of the unprecedented event that the global community is facing with the COVID crisis. In the words of the United Nations Secretary General, it is not just a health crisis. It is a jobs pandemic, a humanitarian pandemic, and a development pandemic. So I think we should get started right away. I now invite the United Nations Resident Coordinator for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, Mr. Didier Trebucq, to provide an overview of the launch and the appeal, which has been prepared under his guidance, along with the collaboration of the United Nations country team. The plan embraces the spirit of the United Nations system working as one to address this crisis. Thank you, Didier.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to each of you. On behalf of the United Nations sub-regional team for the Caribbean and Barbados, I really welcome you. Thanks for your participation of this event. To Acting Prime Minister of Barbados, Honorable Santia Bradshaw, who's joined us, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and Chair of the OECS, Honorable Gaston Browne, and Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Honorable Ellen, who is also about to join us in this launch. We know these are busy times and we really highly appreciate your presence today. Thank you also, Excellencies, government and regional institution representatives, development partners, members of the media for taking the time to be with us in the launch. Today I'm joined by the Secretary General, Fekitamoeloa, for Landlocked, Least Developed and SEED countries, and by the heads of the various UN agencies who have played a very important role in putting all this framework together, and especially PAHO, UNDP, FAO, UN Women, UNICEF, UNFPA, WFP, UNOPS, and ILO. This team of UN agencies have, of course, contributed in development of this multi-sectoral response plan and an appeal, and will be responsible for its implementation. So first, let me start by saying that countries in the region have responded well on the health front, in spite of the global tension in accessing and protective equipment and supplies. The spread of the virus, we observe, is being reduced. However, we are concerned by the socio-economic impact of the COVID in the Eastern Caribbean region in particular, and especially considering the high vulnerability of small island states. So in this context, we believe that it just cannot be business as usual. COVID-19 is an unprecedented human crisis that is challenging the social and economic development of seeds and adversely impacting the health, lives and livelihoods of Caribbean citizens. So effective response demands decisive leadership and commitment from all partners around the globe to ensure that no behind, but most important country is left behind. So let me turn a bit to seed vulnerabilities, because as we have seen again, and a few days ago, the devastation caused in the Pacific Ocean by Harold was very illustrative, and the Caribbean could very easily be plunged into similar circumstances in few months as we enter in the 2020 hurricane season next month. So the region basically is 7 times more likely to experience a natural disaster than larger states and can incur as much as 6 times more damages. The Eastern Caribbean also faces economic vulnerabilities due to limited economic diversification and high external debt. Of course, there are a lot of fiscal stimulus measures that have been adopted to keep economies afloat, but that can also exacerbate debt problems, especially if no debt moratorium or debt relief is agreed as a way forward. So the closure of borders and grounding of commercial flights have also placed the Caribbean service-based economies under severe threat. Tourism, as you know, contributes for some islands as much as 50% of GDP and provide jobs for up to 1/2 of labor forces in this region. The downturns in regional economies caused by COVID has also exacerbated the risks of social inequalities and gaps. For example, the job losses has compounded unemployment, which currently ranges between 10 to 25% across the region. And I have to say that a lot has been done to protect the most vulnerable, including women, the elderly, persons with disability, children, but a lot still, of course, remains to be done. Many who work in the informal sector are uninsured and have difficulties accessing some social protection schemes. Women also primarily act as caregivers, as we know, placing them on the front line of the response and at high risk of contracting the virus. So let's also remember that the school closures and the lockdown measures place children and women at greater risk of domestic violence. So in that context, I want to talk a bit about how the United Nations can and expect to support the sub-region. Given that at this time of greater uncertainty, the Caribbean has never before needed the level of assistance that it is today. The region not only requires adequate fiscal space and resources to embark on a comprehensive socio-economic response to COVID, but it also needs technical expertise to effectively target the most vulnerable now, as well as in the longer term, as they seek to restore an income security following this crisis. And I think, for example, of low-skilled employees who have recently lost their jobs in the sector, of fishermen belonging to vulnerable households who are currently suffering from this lockdown. We have heard, I must say, the resounding call from CARICOM countries for urgent debt restructuring or forgiveness. We have also heard the most recent appeal for urgent attention to be given to Caribbean seats, moral leadership made by CARICOM Chairman, Prime Minister Mia Mottley, TV interview. Please count on the UN to help garner a wider support. So in that respect, today, the UN team for the Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean is truly pleased to launch the multi-sectoral response plan and the 29 million funding appeal for Barbados and Eastern Caribbean seats. This is, in a way, the UN's efforts to support those countries in fostering international solidarity and help mobilize financial resources to meet some of their needs at least over the next 8 months. It is also aimed at supporting the ongoing advocacy by the Eastern Caribbean states and Eastern Caribbean leaders for a differential treatment based on their vulnerability, and not criteria. and support them to access more resources. This is critical. So you can see now on the screen a snapshot about the multi-sectoral response plan. This is basically an integrated strategy that brings together 11 UN agencies as one. And it has 3 key objectives. First, to contain the spread of the COVID-19. Second, to minimize its social and economic impact and ensure resilient recovery. And finally, to promote the protection and well-being on the most vulnerable. This plan is going to be implemented through 8 pillars. First, health and wellness, because it's important to continue strengthening health systems, and there is always a risk for second waves. Second, food and nutrition security, to ensure especially that vulnerable households involved with the agri-sector remain resilient. Third, economic recovery and livelihoods, both to support micro and small and medium enterprises in this economic turmoil, but also to refine country-level assessment of the economic impact. Fourth, education, because it's important to support safe school operations and e-learning, especially for underprivileged children. Then social protection, mostly to expand safety net measures, such as cash transfer, to support the most vulnerable households in the region. Then we believe it's extremely important to prevent and address gender-based violence or violence against children. We have actually observed a sharp increase of domestic violence during lockdown periods. Then human rights as a means to provide policy guidance for protection of the most vulnerable. And finally, logistics supply chain management in order to support CDIMA in setting up regional logistic hubs under the leadership of Caribbean countries. So to date, the UNS team, the UN sub-regional team for Barbados, has responded to the immediate needs of the Caribbean by repurposing or mobilizing resources for up to $7 million for COVID. COVID countries will also benefit from the refocusing of around 1 million grants per country from the UN partnership funds to respond to COVID-19. For example, USAID has also already recently contributed to UN's response in the Eastern Caribbean. While this is a start, and we are happy to note there's progress and solidarity, the needs of the region require cooperation go beyond this and other national or regional initiatives. The reason behind today's launch and only appeal. I wish to stress that it was developed through a consultative process with government representatives and several needs assessment, and this funding appeal for the Eastern Caribbean is also linked to the global socio-economic framework and its global funding instrument. So as we seek to build on the support already extended to our friends in the Eastern Caribbean, I want to assure governments and the people of the Eastern Caribbean that you have our full support. Development partners, we count on your usual solidarity and cooperation to make this possible. Thank you again for your existing and partnerships. To our media colleagues who are with us today, we're depending on you to amplify the launch of this appeal so that the right people, wherever in the world they are, will hear positively respond. Colleagues, as I said in the opening, it cannot be business as usual. I therefore, on behalf of the UN team, make this urgent appeal for international solidarity for the needs of the Eastern Caribbean states to be given the highest priority. And finally, I would like to say that if this pandemic has taught us something, I think it has taught us that we are in this together. We are far more resilient than we imagine, and together we can most certainly emerge stronger. So I thank you again for joining us today, and hand over the floor to my colleague Michel to hear from Prime Ministers who are with us today and from USG Utoikamanu. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Didier, for your remarks. highlighting the necessity of as well as global solidarity as we face this COVID, only at an international level, but it is so critical for the Caribbean, which is uniquely and has a complex set of vulnerabilities that are only exacerbated by this COVID health crisis, as well as the ongoing socioeconomic impact. And this is where the United Nations Multi-sectoral Response Plan and its integrated approach is intended to help the Eastern Caribbean region mobilize international solidarity and financial support to boost the region's response to the impacts of the virus. We are now honored today to be joined by Ms. Fekitamoeloa, the UN Undersecretary General, High Representative for the least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and the small island developing states. The UN system is resolved to ensure that no country is left behind in relation to the COVID-19 crisis. And the UN is working at the highest level to bring visibility, unique needs of SIDS. We would like to extend our gratitude to the Undersecretary General for her presence and commitment to advocating for SIDS, her distinguished leadership at the highest level of the UN system in promoting global action for the full implementation of the Samoa Pathway, and her leadership in ensuring that the perspectives of SIDS are fully integrated into the United Nations system. I would now like to invite the Undersecretary General to provide her remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, MC. Your Excellencies, the Right Honorable Gaston Browne, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, the Right Honorable Chastanet, Prime Minister of St. Lucia, Right Honorable Gaston Browne, Acting of Barbados, Mr. Didier, Trebucq, RC Barbados and Eastern Caribbean United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, I'm to join you, and especially because this is the very first COVID-19 appeal of this nature that supports SIDS. It is great, it is above all to see the leadership of the governments involved and supported your partner, the United Nations team. I want to give a hand to the UN sub-regional team, having shown how responding as one to COVID-19 response can be done and must be done. Everybody everywhere is touched by COVID-19, but how we individuals and societies go through the pandemic and respond to it is greatly, and the situation of SIDS is especially complex. It would greatly help if life one dimension undertaking. Well, it is not. It is complex and multidimensional, as we say in our jargon. So I welcome that the proposed plan is grounded in that multidimensional perspective. It is the only way to go, and it mirrors the United States in addressing the immediate needs, but also the long-term consequences through a mutually reinforcing three-pillar approach: humanitarian, health, and socio-economic interventions. As far as I can think back, only one other lived experience comes to mind where SIDS were existentially worried if a then not understood virus could literally wipe out their populations. And that was when we learned about HIV virus. So far, SIDS have managed to contain severe outbreaks, but the social and economic costs are likely to exceed anything we may have projected. SIDS do face very, very special circumstances ranging from remoteness to small population bases to fragile, often single product-driven economies. We know that, but once more, these specific and complex factors SIDS have to manage require fast, adequate, and major support. As an example, tourism globally has flatlined and is projected to remain so for many months to come. Yet for many SIDS, this is a key source of employment and income, tourism comprising more than 50% of GDP, as mentioned earlier. Many SIDS lack access to existing windows for concession refinance, despite their well-established vulnerabilities. SIDS have therefore called for a dedicated specific funding facility, as well as to open up access to all SIDS. Given the stress on the global financial system, how will this play out for SIDS? SIDS are not in many instances equipped with the robust preventative and curative health system this challenge demands. And how will they compete in a globally stressed market for the supply of PPE or medications? Some SIDS do not generate income due to the global shutdown, while creditors continue to claim payment. These costs compete with nurses, cleaners, and other essential workers in the middle of a global crisis. Just as some G20 countries called for African, we need to consider this urgently for SIDS. In this context, I draw your attention to our Secretary General's framework for debt relief, debt and COVID-19, a global response in solidarity, and his engagement with international financial institutions. The needs for SIDS are urgent. If they are not addressed now with urgency, the likely result will be longer-term poverty and hardship for many, in particular combined with climate change, natural disasters, and other shocks. None of this pauses as a result of COVID-19. This means the SIDS and their peoples will be behind as far as the implementation of the Samoa Pathway and Agenda 20 and its goals are concerned. We cannot allow for this to happen. The time to act is now. The SIDS cannot go this alone, and I hope find the United Nations as your trustworthy, competent, and loyal partner, as we have done so throughout many decades. But it is a time to call on partners to pledge contributions to the Eastern Caribbean MRP appeal. Your firm commitment to the SIDS is needed more than ever and is needed now. As I've said earlier, everybody everywhere is touched by this unprecedented pandemic of our 21st century. This is a time for global solidarity, in particular with the most vulnerable countries. We cannot afford to leave them behind and let inequality grow even further. We need your support to address the SIDS' unique challenges and situation. Thank you.
Very much, Undersecretary General, for your comments, both highlighting the struggles and challenges that SIDS experience. Generally speaking, and certainly there's special vulnerability at this time, but you also emphasize the resilience that SIDS that SIDS have gone through some similar challenges in the past, or extremely dire challenges in the past, and SIDS have come through it. So thank you very much for those comments. I want to remind all the participants that we will have a question and answer session at the end of this, at the end of the presentations of our speakers. And I would encourage again the participants to provide questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. It is now my pleasure to Foreign Affairs for Barbados, Mr. Jerome Walcott, who is Joe of the Acting Prime Minister for Barbados. But thank you very much for making yourself available to us at such short. I will now hand the floor over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Madam Chair. Thank you. It is indeed at short notice. And good evening to Honorable Prime Minister Alan Chastanet of St. Lucia, the Honorable Gaston Browne, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, to Undersecretary Fekitamoeloa, the UN High Representative for SIDS and LA countries, indeed also Monsieur Didier Trebucq, the UN Resident Coordinator, and also the members of the sub-regional team based in Barbados. First of all, I must issue two apologies. The Honorable Minister Miriam Mortley is unable to be with us this evening for another reason. She had an important appointment. I believe it was a medical appointment. And she'd asked Mrs. Santia Bradshaw to deputize for her. I just asked me, we were in a meeting all morning, if I could come in and join this meeting. So you would bear with me in terms of my presentation. First of all, I must say that Barbados, the government of Barbados, is extremely pleased to be part of this launch this afternoon with the UN in terms of the funding appeal for this UN very important COVID-19 multi-sector response Eastern Caribbean. We all recognize that the world has been struck by this global pandemic since 2020. Countries in the Caribbean, small island development states, already face a number of challenges. And it occurs almost at a time when it is too much to bear in terms of what we are faced with daily and yearly in terms of high economic impact that this will have on us, on already vulnerable states, We have our fragile economies dependent primarily on tourism, which has been devastated by this pandemic. We have faced external shocks, economic shocks. I believe some of us are facing in terms of the blacklisting as it comes from the EU as we try to create another niche for our economies. We have indeed limited access to funding. We have been told that we're graduated to middle income level and we don't qualify in terms of grant funding. We have limited fiscal space. And indeed, every year, the scourges of climate change in the forms of hurricanes. And so as we battle with all of these, we are now faced with a pandemic situation, the pandemic of COVID. In terms of already some of us reeling under these hardships already, we have limited healthcare resources, infrastructure, and the UN is to be praised for the effort it has made regard and recognize the issues that we find and as small island development states in the Caribbean, inherent vulnerabilities. And so they should be commended in this effort to support our countries in Western international solidarity and our belief in multilateralism, in trying to help to mobilize vitally needed resources to meet the needs of Barbados and indeed small island development states. We certainly welcome the efforts of the United Nations in responding to our pleas and needs at this point in time. And I believe that it goes from what has been said earlier in terms of the outline, the 8 pillars of work identified by the UN country change. Certainly the sub-regional team certainly shows the amount of work and analysis that has been put into this process, recognizing the various areas in which we need a definite assistance, be it in health wellness, be it in food and nutrition and security standards, in terms of our economic recovery and the need that we can assist can be rendered there, in issues in terms of education disrupted in several of our countries, and vitally the protection of the social protection of those most vulnerable at this point in time. I want to say that it is a time for us that our Prime Minister has spoken recently in terms of the need for new global moral leadership, the importance of multilateralism, and I want to take this opportunity it is a need for extraordinary support for the UN in terms of this entire process. And I'm calling on our development partners to try to help us address a number of these challenges which are now being posed and indeed exacerbated by COVID-19 by earmarking resource Eastern Caribbean through funding to this appeal. I thank you.
Very much, Minister Walk. Thank you very much, Minister Walker, for your presence at this meeting today. We are very grateful that you had the opportunity to share with us some details on the nature of the Caribbean states face, specifically highlighting the necessity of the multi-sectoral response that the Undersecretary General also highlighted in her remarks. Thank you again. It is now my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Alan Chastanet, Prime Minister of St. Lucia, providing an excellent example of a Caribbean country that has aggressive and successful measures to limit the spread of COVID-19. And yet, in spite of the strong healthcare response that Caribbean countries have had, the socioeconomic consequences are still very dire. And again, further exacerbated by some of the vulnerabilities that we've discussed today. So thank you again, Prime Minister Chastanet, for joining us. And I turn the mic over to you.
Thank you very much. With all protocol being established, again, thank you for this opportunity to share our experiences and certainly participating in a way forward. The UN's multi-sectoral approach is very appropriate and signifies the overall impact of the COVID. So unlike some of the disasters we've had in the past, particularly as it pertains to climate change and hurricanes, we're seeing now a complete impact across our sector, our different sectors of our society. That really is the ability of government to continue funding business as usual. And I certainly want to take this opportunity to highlight a couple of things. And if I can go back in history a little bit. First of all, the impact of 9/11, the impact of the financial crisis, and most recently, the impact of climate change. And as a SID, we've certainly been marginalized by all of these events. And what we have learned since 1991, when we had, since 2001, when we had 9/11, is that the SIDS are not fitting in appropriately into the global economic architecture. And the continuation of using per capita GDP as a measurement to determine what support SIDS should be getting, once again, we have now found the failings of that methodology. So after 9/11 and the financial crisis that ensued, there was no mechanism to help us. After the financial crisis and the G20 was formed and the global architecture, economic architecture resolved the problems of the developed world, left to fend for ourselves. We've seen recently that since the hurricanes in 2017, hurricane of 2019, the Bahamas, that again, despite the calamity that faced us, that the global economic architecture failed us once again. Here, not being able to recover from the level of devastation. And certainly per capita GDP being used as an indicator as to our level of development. This all comes in the face of the fact that the Commonwealth Secretariat had developed the index since 1989, and we've not seen the adoption of it or even the improvement of that initial index. And why do I say that? So here we are again, a time in which, to no fault of anyone, a pandemic has arisen. As a result of it, unprecedentedly, global economy has been shut down, and we have now found ourselves fighting two battles, one on the health side, COVID, and the other one on an economic side. The developed world showed us what the solution was, which was to create liquidity. Sadly for us, we are not in a position to create that same level of liquidity. We're all contending the IMF and the World Bank and following the strict protocols that have been established for us from an economic development perspective, i.e. debt to GDP, a 3% primary surplus, no more than a 3% overall deficit. These numbers now have become impossible to be conformed to, given the calamity where St. Lucia has seen a drop of 60% in its overall revenues. And the reality is that we have no idea how long that is going to. Is it going to be 2 months? Is it going to be 3 months? Is it going to be months before that we see the global economies return to some level of normalcy? And what is the new normal going to be? When the ECCB and the World Bank and CDB put out a prognosis that our overall GDP is going to contract somewhere between 23 to 18%. How does a country like St. Lucia move forward when we're now struggling just to pay salaries and to pay our debt? And so this cross-sectorial approach that the UN has provided is absolutely necessary because many of the critical social programs that we have are in jeopardy. Even our participation on a regional level, being able to meet our commitments on a regional level, i.e. at the OECS or even CARICOM, is going to be put to the greatest test. So I want to support the program that's being presented here today, but I also want to make a very special appeal. And I think that the UN and the Commonwealth Secretariat are very well placed to do this. There needs to be an urgent meeting for the SIDS to talk about how we're going to fit into the new economic architecture. Not continue to come and make cases theoretically on the need for our exceptions, and then for us to have the evidence of a 9/11, of an economic crisis, and also of climate change, and now again of a pandemic, to confirm the idea that there is some level of exceptionalism that's required for SIDS. I cannot emphasize to everyone who is listening to this emphasize to everyone enough how difficult a task that we have. Nonetheless, we're all putting policies in place to attempt to survive in the hopes that by this summer, early fall, that there can be a meeting to discuss what additional support can be provided to the SIDS now, and certainly in terms of the support that we're going to get moving forward in the future. I thank you for this opportunity, and I want to again thank and congratulate the UN for this timely initiative.
Very much, Prime Minister. Thank you very much, Prime Minister Chastanet, for your comments. We appreciate your pulling in some historical context about the challenges that SIDS have faced, whether it relates to climate change, previous economics, or large international events, and the fact that SIDS have all too frequently found themselves marginalized because they don't fit neatly into this global economic framework that tends to center around GDP. We appreciate your comments regarding the adoption of a vulnerability index that takes much more into account. And certainly your advocacy as well for SIDS to come together in solidarity, to talk about how SIDS will fit into the new global economic architecture. Thank you very much for joining us again in your comments. I am happy to recognize our next speaker, the Right Honorable Gaston Browne, Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda and Chairman of the OECS. Antigua and Barbuda has also taken strong measures to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on the lives and the livelihoods of Antigua and Barbudans. I would like to invite the Honorable Prime Minister Browne to deliver his remarks now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairlady. And let me acknowledge my colleague Prime Minister, the Honorable Alan Chastanet, Minister Walcott from Barbados, and of course the UN Secretary General. Please let me, first of all, thank the United Nations for launching this multi-sectoral response to literally support the stabilization and recovery efforts of the OECS countries and Barbados. Now about the vulnerabilities of these countries, which have been characterized as SIDS, even though within the OECS. In essence, they are micro-states. You're looking at small countries with populations on the 200,000 people, and with economies less than $2 billion US. So they are really micro-states. And they have all of the structural problems of small countries with the heavy vulnerability in terms of vulnerabilities of their small size, their limited capital formation, and in some instances, monocultural economies. And we all know too of the vulnerability to climate change. The reality is, because of these vulnerabilities, we have had to spend scarce resources repeatedly to rebuild damaged infrastructure from hurricanes, and even to borrow to sustain economies that would have been literally decimated by external shocks, to a crisis of 2008, 2009, as well as now COVID. In fact, if I were to give a typical example as to what would have happened to Antigua and Barbuda during the last decade, then perhaps there will be greater understanding or better understanding of the gravity of the issue. Because I have suspect that the community who see us as elegant beggars and believe that we're always using the opportunity to seek debt relief and official development assistance. Now, the global crisis resulted in a GDP of 25% here in Antigua and Barbuda. And 2 years ago, we had a 15% reduction in our economy as a result of Hurricane Irma, which decimated Barbuda. And now the projected decline from COVID will be 20%. You do the math, it's 60% reduction in our GDP within a period of 10 years. And when you have those type of shocks, and you have to mitigate against those shocks, invariably it results in a high and unsustainable debt to GDP and a very high debt service ratio. I mean, our debt after the global crisis was 102%. Within the last 5 years, we sit down to about 69%. And now we have to take it back up perhaps beyond 102%. Now, the reality is the international community could assist because these countries within the region, we have very limited fiscal space. So, and the other thing too, we don't have the type of instruments like, quantitative easing and printing commercial money in order to raise capital. Those options are not available to us. And when we do borrow, almost invariably, it is on commercial terms. In fact, Antigua graduated to the so-called high-income status, which is utter nonsense, on the basis that it has of about $18,000 per person. But happening is that assessments are looking at the structure of the economy. They're not looking at the fact that many of the Caribbean countries, they're really plantation economies in terms of the structure of the, and a lot of the profits that are generated in these countries, the profits are actually repatriated. You look at the banking sector, most of the profits, they go abroad. The telecom sector, most of the profits they go abroad, even within utilities in a number of our countries. So whereas, yes, there's a significant amount of commercial activity, economic activity, adding to very high, per capita incomes, the reality of the people is a different reality. The people are relatively poor. They're still struggling to survive, to get the basic needs as outlined in the Sustainable Development Goals. But yet still, we've been characterized as wealthy countries, and wealthy countries that can take on responsibilities to stimulate economies as a result of these crises, which we obviously would not have had any role in not even climate change. In fact, we all know that we have been at the receiving end of climate change because of the profligacy of wealthy nations. And instead of assisting us to get cheap funding, including ODA, to accelerate our transition into green energy, it's all kind of bureaucracy and all sorts of classifications that would preclude us from getting funding. I mean, even in terms of our debt. Now, clearly, if the international community cannot assist us at a time when we are seeing the worst crisis, when are they going to assist us? Where are they going to be able to assist these microstates? Some of us have debts that made Paris Club debts for decades, and they still force us to take on those debts. Now, if those Paris Club countries were to write off those debts, first of all, they haven't gone paid for 40 years, so it doesn't mean anything to them. And technically speaking, they are not within their current budget. It have not been in their budgets for decades. So why would they want to continue to push to collect those debts? And if these countries go into IMF programs, you will have a situation in which the amounts of the debts that you have to honor, which would have been unpaid for decades, will actually exceed the amount that they do in financial support. Now, that type of that type of response is not an appropriate response for small, vulnerable countries. And I think that they have to look at some granular detail in terms of what is happening within these countries, and to come up with bespoke solutions. We are not opportunistically seeking ODA and debt relief. It is an absolute necessity. And it's not a case that there is any management by Caribbean governments. The truth is, we don't have any monies to support any profligacy. The head region, we're not stealing public servants' money. The reality is, we have very limited resources, we have structural problems, and we have had to borrow repeatedly, as I said, to deal with all exogenous shocks. And therefore, we need a more responsive international community. And I'm happy that the United Nations is providing us this opportunity to at least raise some funds in the interim. I'm hoping that we can even increase the ambition beyond the 30 million. I mean, we are appreciative of the fact that, you're starting at 30, but the reality is this region needs hundreds of millions of dollars in order to stabilize the situation as a consequence of COVID. And, the international community, especially the G20 countries, I think there has to be some level of direct support for these small states and even other CARICOM countries that are suffering at this time. But, forcing us to carry high debt loads and then to find fresh money to stimulate and to stabilize, and then we would not be able to achieve the SDGs. So again, there's some simple interventions that could be made. Historical debts that that carry no real value for these Paris Club countries written off automatically. We should not have to beg them during this difficult period to write them off. They have no value to them. These are not even debts that are in the books. We even came up with the idea of having some form of debt for climate swap as well to help our transition into green energy applications. And those are not things that will create any significant burden for the international community. And let me also make the point here too that if you have these bad debts that they're carrying for decades and they write off, it's a paper transaction. It's no real cash. I think that they are just really bureaucratic and they have been unresponsive. And the United Nations, you can help us to be strong advocates, especially for those nuisance debts. All they're doing is to literally use them as a noose around our necks. So if it is that they're arguing that they are not in a position to write off current debts, I'm not saying that is sufficient, but at least write off those bad debts. Because again, if we were not able to pay them, how are we going to pay them during a period of COVID? Common sense must prevail. And again, I just hope that we can accelerate these arguments that some attention will be given to the intervention at this time. Again, we're not being elegant nuisance, or let's say elegant beggars, just trying to put our hands in their pockets. We need help, and now is the time to give us the help. If we can't get the help now, then it's pointless afterwards. What are you going to do? Allow our economies to end up in free fall, to allow all the developmental gains that we have made, notwithstanding the various challenges, to be eroded? Because at the end of the day, we have to understand that we're all interconnected, and the vulnerability of these small countries within the Caribbean region, they also represent the vulnerability of the wealthy. Because ultimately, if our people can't live going to the shores of the wealthy nations as refugees, so proactive leadership is required, global solidarity is required, the support of the UN, the advocacy of the UN, and I just hope we can convince international. Thank you very much, Madam Chair Lady.
Thank you very much, Prime Minister Browne. Thank you very much for and passionate comments regarding this issue. Prime Minister Browne, as well as many other Caribbean leaders, unfortunately have direct experience with negotiating and managing multiple threats that the region faces. And I thank you for bringing up the issue of the sustainability of small island developing states accruing additional debt whenever it's affected by one of these multiple threats. So thank you for your contributions. We are now going to move in to our question and segment for this launch. I want to remind the participants that you have the opportunity to post any questions or comments that you might have at the bottom of your screen in the comment section. Unfortunately, we will only have time today probably to field 5 to 6 questions, but we assure you we'll answer all of the questions that you send to us. Please be sure to include your contact information when you send those questions so that we can be sure to follow up, if not today. But before we get into the question and answer session, I would like to take the opportunity to invite some of our partners to provide a few comments. The first I would like to invite is His Excellency Dr. K.J. Srivastava, the High Commissioner of India and the accredited ambassador to the CARICOM Secretariat. High Commissioner, you have the floor. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, Excellency, heads of governments, dignitaries, diplomatic colleagues, friends from various agencies and the media, all protocols observed. Namaste, greetings from India. The world is going through one of the toughest times in its history, and the OECS and its countries in the Caribbean region are facing the economic impact of the pandemic with particular hardship related to livelihoods, and supplies. For India, the Caribbean region occupies a special place. We place high value on all the countries in the region, and we believe that international solidarity and cooperation is the keystone during this crisis. India has always remained responsible and reliable by living up to its international commitments. In the initial stages of this pandemic itself, the Prime Minister of India, Honorable Mr. Narendra Modi, began interacting with various heads of states and governments, both bilaterally and multilaterally, in connection with and to coordinate Indian and global initiatives to fight the global pandemic. Organizations including the SAARC, G20, the Non-Aligned Movement, etc., were involved, wherein he has been stressing on focusing more on humanitarian issues, sharing of medical research, minimizing of economic and social cost of the pandemic to restore global growth, market stability, and strengthening resilience. The External Affairs Minister of India, Dr. Jaishankar, is also actively engaging, and he has done so far with about 39 foreign ministers of the world, and has spoken to some of the countries in the region already and will continue to do so. India has since offered assistance to our friendly partner countries the world over, sharing the best practices of India in controlling and containing COVID-19, and has since assisted 55 countries with medical supplies and equipment, with plans to assist over 100 more countries. As a friendly gesture and to help friendly partner countries in the region and across the world, essential medicines like paracetamol, hydroxychloroquine, other important medicines, medical equipment, including protective equipment, etc., are being supplied on priority basis from India. As we speak, logistics are being worked out for the Caribbean for this purpose. As proposed during Prime Minister Modi's meeting with CARICOM leaders in September 2019 in New York, India had made 3 offers of assistance to the CARICOM countries. A US $14 million grant, which works out to about $1 million per CARICOM member state, for quick impact community development projects in the CARICOM countries, which we believe can now be used for health-related infrastructure improvement projects, including procurement of ventilators and to upgrade the hospitals, etc., to combat COVID-19. This is apart from the special capacity building courses, training, and deputation of experts based on the needs and requirements of the CARICOM countries, which can now be tailor-made into health-related issues, livelihood expertise, etc. We anticipate specific individual proposals from the members of the CARICOM. These are processed under the India-UN Development Partnership Fund and managed by the UN Office for South-South Cooperation, with the execution of projects by an on-site UN agency, which will, of course, in close collaboration, work with the host government. The modalities for this fund do not envisage any cash transfers. India, being the 3rd largest manufacturer of pharmaceuticals in the world, we can also offer friendly collaboration of our healthcare sector and pharma sector with the Pharmaceutical Procurement Service of the OECS that procures medicines and allied health equipment on behalf of member states. I believe this cooperation will realistically help the countries to facilitate access and availability of medicines to the people of OECS at affordable prices and annual cost savings. India has always emphasized the importance of a coordinated, inclusive, and equitable response by the world to this crisis. And today, we would like to reaffirm India's readiness to offer assistance in solidarity with the Caribbean region to the extent possible. While suggesting usage of the assistance announced at the first India CARICOM Summit in 2019, India, to the extent possible, in whatever suitable manner to mitigate the adverse effects of the current pandemic, I assure you once again that India will stand shoulder to shoulder with the OECS and CARICOM countries in tackling this health crisis. I thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, High Commissioner, for your comments. In the interest of time, we'll move on to, we're informed that the Ambassador of Japan indicated that he would like to make an intervention at this time. I will hand the floor to the Ambassador.
He's muted.
Yes, do you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we hear you well. Thank you.
Yes. Well, just a few words. Thank you very much for convening this timely and very informative meeting. As far as Japan is concerned, based upon the commitment made by Prime Minister Abe Shinzo at the first Japan CARICOM Summit in 2014, Japan, having in mind the vulnerability of small island countries, always stands ready to offer appropriate support to those countries without regards to the level of GDP per capita. I will convey the contents of today's this very fruitful meeting to Tokyo, and I hope we'll come back to you as soon as possible. That's all. Thank you very much.
Very much. Thank you very much for your comments. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon.
Afternoon.
Didier?
Yes, good afternoon. We can hear you.
Excellent. Okay. Didier, Your Excellencies, I think all protocols have already been observed. So I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you for giving me the floor and a chance to respond to what has been presented. I also want to offer my congratulations to the UN team for pulling together this plan and this funding appeal, and clearly working so well with partner governments around the region to produce it, which is no mean feat in these unusual times. The fight against COVID is obviously a challenge that binds us together in new and unprecedented ways. And while the threats and the impacts that we are all facing are indeed frightening, I think it's reassuring to see how we are all coming together to confront the threat head on. And of course, the UN system has a unique role to play in this regard, in terms of providing us with leadership, in terms of providing a forum for dialogue and discussion, and in terms of providing the mechanisms for a coordinated response. As all of you, I'm sure, will know, the UK is currently involved in a Herculean struggle on our own doorstep against this deadly disease, which has strained every sinew of our health service and the wider public sector in the UK. But I speak from the heart when I say I'm particularly proud that this has in no way blunted my government's commitment to the wider global response. And as the speaker from India said, we also are proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with our partners in the Caribbean and across the world in confronting this deadly threat. And we certainly recognize all the challenges that eminent leaders around this virtual space have mentioned pertaining to the particular challenges that SIDS face, whether in terms of fiscal space, access to resources, or the capacity of public health systems to respond. The UK so far committed £744 million, or close to $1 billion, to stop the spread of the disease, to find a vaccine and save lives around the world. This includes £250 million for the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, or CEPI, to support research for finding a vaccine. And it also includes £150 million for the UN's global appeal, with resources for WHO, but also UNICEF, UNHCR, WFP, and UNFPA, from which this region is benefiting. Alongside this, we've ramped up our support to the international financial institutions We've doubled our contribution to £2.2 billion for the IMF's Poverty and Growth Trust Fund, which has already provided emergency funding for Dominica, Grenada, and St. Lucia in this region, and a further £150 million to the Catastrophic Containment Relief Fund, from which Haiti has benefited in the wider region. But I fully appreciate all the comments that have been made, that this is not just about aid. And we fully recognise that many countries in this region face a huge constraint in terms of servicing debt obligations. We recognise that there's a real risk that countries in this region in particular will suffer from debt distress in the months and years to come, which is why the UK worked so hard with fellow G20 members to support the suspension of debt repayments for 2020, and which is why we've encouraged the multilateral institutions, the IFIs and private sector creditors to follow suit. Now, coming back to this appeal, the UK wants to endorse it very strongly for four main reasons. Firstly, because it's rooted in an understanding of the context and the specific and acute vulnerabilities that Caribbean SIDS face at this time. Secondly, because it represents the UN's best efforts to marshal the evidence and the data and the learning from previous crises to inform the response now. Thirdly, because it's truly multi-sectoral in nature. It's an integrated plan that looks at the short run and medium run responses that are going to be required to support the region through the current crisis and beyond. And last, but certainly not least, because it represents a sincere effort on behalf of the UN family for a genuine one UN response to this crisis, drawing on all the competencies and strengths of different agencies. I think we would like the UN to go even further though, and articulate how it intends to work with some of the key international financial institutions who are obviously an important part of the response, working alongside partner countries. So the UK is very happy to endorse this plan. And while I know this isn't a pledging conference per se, I'd like to mention that over recent days, we've agreed with our ministers a new £5 million package to support the COVID response in the region. So this includes £3 million support for PAHO to provide for essential equipment needs, PPE and testing kits in the region, which is in addition to our contribution to the WHO global appeal, from which countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region have benefited. We've also earmarked a further £2 million window for support to social protection measures around the region, and we're in discussion with relevant UN agencies about how we might programme a portion of that. We're also working closely with colleagues in WFP, UNDP and UNFPA through our existing support to the Engender programme to think about how those resources can be marshalled to support some of the most vulnerable communities in the region, and particularly to address the scourge of domestic violence, which, as was noted at the outset, is a real risk in the current context. I should also mention that we're looking at ways to reprogram the UK's £400 million development programme for the Caribbean region, which on a per capita basis is actually one of the UK's biggest development programmes in the world. But we want to strain every sinew within the region to think about how we can use our resources to support the challenges of today and tomorrow. So rest assured, the UK will be playing our part to support this appeal, and we look forward to working closely with partners in the UN system and beyond to counter the spread of this virus and hopefully help the people of the region move forward to a better and brighter future. I thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kossoff, for your inputs regarding the UK's support as the COVID crisis in the region. I would now like to hand it over to Mr. Lucia, Head of Cooperation for the European Union Delegation to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Mr. Maya, please.
Thank you very much. Protocol being observed, I just want to say a few words to thank you for inviting me to participate in this presentation of the multi-sectoral response plan for the Eastern Caribbean. I would like to welcome this UN initiative and express the support of the European Union. The European Union and UN and its agencies have a long story of working together in this region in a wide range of sectors. And I am sure that this strong partnership will continue and will be reinforced. The coronavirus pandemic requires united global action in response. The European Union and its member states are playing their parts in tackling this health crisis and its severe consequences at home and abroad. While we are doing everything we can to provide support to our citizens in Europe, we also need to assist our partners and friends in the Caribbean region to address the impacts this crisis will have on their livelihoods, stability, and security. Your problems are our problems. This is a global fight that we will either win or lose together. Cooperation and joint efforts at the international level and multilateral solutions are the way forward for a true global agenda for the future. And this is why I reiterate once again our support to this initiative. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maya. Thank you all excellencies for your interventions this and your expression of commitment to the region. I would like to remind everyone that we're still taking questions if you have any, which you can direct to any of our panelists. Thus far, we have received a couple of questions regarding the UN's support to the Caribbean as it relates to debt reduction. And so pose a question to Mr. Trebucq, at least to start, and that is, how can the United Nations influence the G20 nations to assist SIDS, either through debt relief or restructuring the lending criteria for SIDS? Thank you.
Yes, what I can say on that is precisely the EU participated in the last G20 meeting precisely to advocate for debt relief, for new mechanisms to forgive, for example, bad debt that Prime Minister Browne was mentioning. And there is even a paper that has been produced in that respect. So this is really an initiative that is very, very strongly backed up by the United Nations globally as a whole, and expect a real change in paradigm in that respect. Regionally, I want to highlight also an initiative by the Regional Commission for Economics regarding the debt swap initiative that is somehow ongoing with some of the countries of the Eastern Caribbean, the objective being to convert debt into a resilience fund. So we also hope that this contribution directly from the UN system can help in that respect. And finally, I want to highlight ongoing work that has started with the Caribbean Development Bank to elaborate or build another initiative from the Commonwealth, which is basically oriented towards the design of a new vulnerability index in order to move away from the sole criteria that has been highlighted by, I think, all our panelists, and really in order to change the rule of the games on how development assistance, how concessional funding, how I can say the special treatment for trades are being given to especially countries. So we are very hopeful that very soon we can further advance to finalize this ongoing work and promote a mobility index that can be accepted by the largest number of stakeholders. I welcome also intervention of my colleagues from the UN team on that specific topic of debt relief.
Any of our UN colleagues are free to also field the question and provide their input if they would like.
We have ECLAC, we have UNDP. If you wish to intervene, please.
Please
raise your hand.
Feel free to raise your hand in the comment section. Or any other questions maybe that persons might wish to pose as slowing down our proceedings today?
All right.
Yes, I think we may wish to wrap up. Perhaps any of our media representatives who are currently on wish to pose a question directly to our panelists or to Didier. Please sure to raise your hand before you, so that we know that you would like to ask a question. Okay, well, listen, I thank you very much. I would like to thank our distinguished guests for their really helpful interventions throughout the course of the last hour and a half, as we have both detailed the multi-sectoral response plan, the United Nations multi-sectoral response plan to COVID in the region. As we discussed, 8 pillars, a number of objectives, $30 million. I suspect the messages have resonated with those who participated in our call today. I will now turn it over to Mr. Trebucq to close the proceedings.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Minister Gaston Browne, Prime Minister Alain Chastanet, Mr. Jerome Walcott, USG Utoikamanu for joining us, and of course all of you participants for accompanying us in this important milestone and launch of this funding appeal. Of course, that's not over. We'll continue over the next few days to advocate for points that we have put on the table today. So this is just the beginning of this initiative. I really want strong support of the UN Secretary General to sit, the UN team for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Pathway remains, of course, central to our compact. The Agenda 2030, Minister Browne, you mentioned that if we're not able to raise resources, provide some additional fiscal space, we might not be able to achieve the SDGs. That's indeed our concern as well. The Paris Agreement, of course, will continue to be the basis for our work and cooperation, considering the threat of climate change in the region. So it's important that we remain, all of us, committed as one to respond to this challenge of the COVID crisis. I also welcome all your comments regarding the necessity of a multi-sectoral response to address the health and socio-economic dimensions of the response to COVID. So count on us. Again, these there to work with all of you, work with all stakeholders, and we hope that this funding appeal will resonate and will result in some additional pledges and support beyond those that have been mentioned today. Thank you very much to those interventions that have been made. And I would finally like to say that, yes, there is a question that has just come, how much of the appeal is already funded? So I will just respond to this. We have received between the funds that have an additional resource that have been mobilized, around $7 million that are being allocated being obligated already that have started to be implemented. So there is a gap of $23 million, but as was mentioned in the presentation, this is for the next 8 months. So these are immediate and medium-term needs. Of course, Prime Minister Browne, for example, mentioned about the need to raise the ambition. And we do agree with that, because we'll have to work towards the medium-term and longer-term impact. And we'll certainly expand this framework of cooperation, including expanding the figures that will have to be mobilized. And we look forward to working also with the international financing institution, World Bank, IDB, so that we work hand in hand in responding to all the requests that we have received today and all the points that have been put on the table. So again, thank you very much to each and everyone joining us today. And as I said, the work is starting today. We look forward to further engaging with you in the coming weeks and months. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much, everyone.